Welcome, everyone. We are going to start. I am Lia Shortino, the founder and director of Junction. And as most of you know by now, Junction is this venue where we try to promote dialogue about Southeast Asia, all kind of issue related to Southeast Asia. And since the very beginning, we have been very concerned with migration, issue of migration, refugees, trafficking, etc., everything that relate with mobility, as it is indeed one of the issue most controversial these days, not only for Thailand, but for the entire world. And there is indeed a need to understand better what are the reality on the ground, what are the trends, what is happening, and what can be done, most importantly, what can be done about. Today, we are very privileged to collaborate with ILO, IOM, and which more? There are a number of organizations, the EU, the European Community, of course. I am part of that, so I should not forget. They have a program indeed which focus on migrants in fishery. And today this report is indeed part of that program. And I am sure Ben will tell us more about later on about the program and what is the purpose. But first, I will give the word to Valentin Moreau, Economic and Policy Analyst for Asia Pacific of the EU delegation, and he will give us some welcoming remarks. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the delegation of the European Union to Thailand, it's a pleasure for me to be here, and I would like to welcome you all for the launch of the latest ILO report towards fair seas on migrant working conditions and forced labor in Southeast Asia, fishing and seafood processing industries. First, I would like to express my gratitude to our partners for making this critical research possible. Of course, Junction for hosting this vital conversation, but also to ILO for their relentless commitment to decent work and social justice, and to Rapid Asia for their rigorous research that is key, and for their dedication to evidence-based solutions. Now, just in a few words, a bit of context to highlight the relevance of this specific project. During the last 30 years, the labor force in Southeast Asia fishing, seafood processing sectors has shifted dramatically in response to the region's rapid and uneven social and economic development. Migrant workers now fill a substantial share of these jobs because of the reluctance of nationals to pursue work in a sector that is often viewed as low paid, demanding, and hazardous. Increasingly, there has been recognition of the need to improve labor rights protection for migrants in Southeast Asia blue economy. Nevertheless, several abuses against migrants fishing and seafood processing workers remain pervasive. This includes cases of contract substitution, retention of identification documents, debt bondage, excessive working hours, and forced labor. In addition, serious accidents and death remain an all too common occurrence within the region's fishing industry, particularly as a result of dangerous working conditions. For women migrants in the seafood processing supply chain, there are continuing problems with discrimination based on their gender and nationality, including gender wage gaps, lack of maternity protection, violence, and harassment. I would like to underline that the EU is committed and really want to bring support to respond to these major sectoral challenges. In these slides, we have been supporting ILO, IOM, and the FAO to implement the Ship to Shore Rights Southeast Asia program. That is a really important program for the EU with a lot of visibility that we define here as a flagship project. To inform this work, the Ship to Shore Rights Southeast Asia program conducted a major research study that is really important. I think that we should really underline the fact that to have a proper impact on policy, it's really important to first have evidence-based study. It's the beginning of a proper assessment of the needs and of a policy dialogue. The European Union therefore welcomes the launch of this new report, which expands the data available to several major destination countries within Asia and represents the largest survey of migrant workers in the fishing and seafood processing sectors conducted in the region to date. Thank you very much. Again, welcome to everyone. It's good to see that the room is crowded and that you came to know more about this study. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And now we are going to listen. Indeed, this is a very impressive study. It's the first time that issue related to migrant labor in fishery have been examined on a regional scale with such an abundance of data, as you will listen later on. But first, we will have David Lindgren, who is the director of Rapid Asia. He's also one of the funding partner of Sea Junction. So I will mention also that, and he will be the first to present, followed by Benjamin, and later I will introduce Ben. Yeah, please.
Hello, you can hear me? Okay. Well, first of all, it's good Sea Junction has expanded to a bigger room because we wouldn't fit here a couple of years ago, I think. So, okay. So thank you very much, Thea and Sea Junction, for organizing today's panel discussion. We are here to launch this report that you see on the screen. This study was conducted by the ILO Ship to Shore Rights Southeast Asia program and indeed Rapid Asia as well, and also with the generous support of the European Union. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank ILO for entrusting Rapid Asia with this work. It's been a pleasure to work with you, Ben, and your team. It's also great to be here in such eminent company, also with Kondrosai. It's great to see you. Okay, I'm going to start off by just reading a little story. This is from a female Vietnamese seafood processor worker in Japan. Can we go to the next slide? Is this? Oh, it's the bottom one. Okay, so this is a story from a female Vietnamese seafood processor worker who migrated to Japan. I decided to migrate to Japan for work in the seafood factory because it was difficult to earn enough income after getting married and having children. Before leaving, I did not have a steady job. I just did whatever work I could find to earn money, but it was not adequate to support my family. So it really did not matter very much to me what my job would be in Japan as long as the income was stable. So I think this story sort of reflects the history of what has happened in the what we call the blue economy, which is, you know, very important for the prosperity of Southeast Asia. Indeed, Thailand is one of the largest fish producers worldwide. During the last 30 years, the workforce has really shifted. So it's gone from, instead of hiring local people, hiring migrant workers. And then because people migrate, and so they are at risk of exploitation, so there has been reports and studies showing that there is, you know, a lot of things going on, including forced labor. And so that's the story. And now with this study, what we really want to do is look at the more regional context. So also look at how is this, so that was the situation in Thailand, and this Rapid Asia did 2 big studies for ILO a few years ago when Thailand got a yellow card from the EU. As a result of that work we did, the Thai government launched an array of different legislation. And that actually helped to reduce forced labor in the fishing industry in Thailand. So the question is, do we see similar patterns in other channels, like people who migrate to Japan or Taiwan or to South Korea? So this is really what this study was about. So we can go to the next slide to talk about the methodology. Sorry, the one before this, I think. Okay. So we just briefly, we did a mixed methodology baseline study. So this was sort of a new study. This was back in 2022. So we interviewed over 1,200 return migrant workers in Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, and also in Vietnam. In cases where people had experienced some form of forced labor, we used CAPI, so it's an electronic system. So we were able to flag them on the system, and the interviewer would recruit them for a follow-up depth interview to talk about more in depth about their experience. We also interviewed with 16 tripartite stakeholders as part of the project. This project also represents the largest survey to date on this topic in the region. Can go to the next. So here you can see the survey sites in the 4 countries. So there were 3 sites that we went to in Myanmar, in Vietnam, also in Cambodia. In Indonesia, we went to 4 sites. You know, we cannot claim that this is a representative sample of all, you know, fishers or seafood workers that migrate from these countries. So we had to sort of make a compromise, going to regions that are known to be sending migrants to these industries, but also trying to spread the sample across different locations to get better representation. All data collection was done face-to-face. Like I said, we used CAPI. So all the data was collected on computer tablets, uploaded to a secure cloud server that Rapid Asia has. So we could also monitor the data on a daily basis for quality control purposes. Now, why did we choose to do an interview with migrants in their home country once they had returned, rather than doing an in-country migrant survey with migrants that are, you know, currently working in the sector? There is a bit of a drawback. I mean, you don't get recency because you have to maybe interview people that returned 2 or 3 years ago. But the advantage is that, of course, once they have returned, they don't have an issue about talking about their experiences. So there's, you know, it's a sensitive topic. So that's why we choose this methodology. And it's a methodology we have used in past migrant studies as well. Can go to the next. So I want to talk a little bit about recruitment. And to lead us off, there's another quote here. This is a male representative of an Indonesian recruitment or manning agency. And he said, the recruitment cost for fishers can vary widely and really depends on the destination country and the manning agency involved. Under law, agencies in Indonesia are not allowed to charge these costs to fishers, as they are supposed to be borne by the vessel owner, so that is the employer. At my agency, we really don't charge fishers anything for recruitment, but I know that some agencies do. Okay, I'm going to come back to that story, but here you can see the migration corridors. And on the left there, you have the for the fishers. So as you can see, if we look at Myanmar in Cambodia. It's a little bit small, but you can see, nearly 100% of all the migrants, they came to Thailand at that point. Maybe for Cambodia, the situation now could be a little bit different. But this was back in 2022, so that was the situation then. Vietnam, most of the workers or the fishers went to South Korea, but you also had a significant proportion going to Taiwan. And then you have Indonesia, which was quite diverse. They go to China. Quite a few also go to Taiwan. They go to South Korea, and they also go to Japan. It's interesting, Japan has come up. That is sort of a bit of a new destination that has caught the attention of ILO and others, I think. And probably it's attractive because of the high salaries that are offered over there. Can go to the next. Okay, this is a table. I know people sometimes don't like tables. But okay, we talking about here about migrant channels. So you see in the colors there, the different countries. And in the light blue, this shows what we call the regular migration channel. So going through a government agency, a licensed private agency, or directly with the employer. And then you have the irregular ones below that, so unlicensed brokers, family and friends, or just going independently on your own. What's interesting here is that overall about 2/3 of migrants are using regular channels, which is good. But you can also see that that is very much predominantly from Vietnam, Indonesia, and to some extent Myanmar. If you look at Cambodia, you see a lot of those migrants, remember, they are going to Thailand, right? Many of them go through irregular channels. And so this is where we know that this opens up problems for migrants. You go through an irregular channel, and then, you're very vulnerable to all sorts of irregularities and abuses. Can go to the next. Okay. Recruitment cost. This is something we typically measure in these studies. It's, a key indicator along the Sustainable Development Goals. So we look at the cost of migration, so the recruitment cost, as a proportion of the annual income. So that ratio is a key indicator. Now, where ILO and other organizations wants to go is, of course, that the recruitment cost should be borne by the employer. It should be zero. But that is almost never the case. So here you can see, and if you look at, for example, Indonesia, they have relatively lower costs. Yeah. But if you look at Vietnam, whether they go to, especially if they go to Japan and Korea, there are very high costs associated with that. They do get higher salaries, but if you look at the cost as a proportion, it represents 6 to 7 months of an annual salary compared to the overall average, which is 3.7 months. So it's nearly double. Of course, you have to take into account that, okay, going from Indonesia to, or from Vietnam to Korea, you have to fly. There are, of course, different costs compared to a migrant from Cambodia going into Thailand. You can take a bus or something. It's relatively cheap. Another thing that's interesting here is that you see an Indonesian worker going to Korea and Japan, they are paid less than a Vietnamese worker going to Korea and Japan. Yeah, so there are clearly also irregularities in terms of people not being paid the same for the same work. So how do people get money to pay for these fees? Well, a lot of migrants, in fact, 6 out of 10 migrants overall have to take a loan, and then they have to repay that debt. In a lot of cases, especially for Indonesia, it's done through wage deductions. Again, that's problematic because the migrant workers, even though they may have signed a contract, they know what the salary is going to be, they're not always clear on how will that be paid. So when they get there, suddenly they get a salary which is lower than expected. Okay, you can go to the next. So what about employment and working conditions? We have another quote here. This is a male Myanmar fisher who came to Thailand. There are no fixed working hours. They just gave us signals when we had to work. If the fish were caught in the trawl, we had to jump into the water and drag the net onto the boat. The rest hours were only about 2 or 3 each day. We only got to rest when there was no fish. If there were fish, we had to work. I think that is a typical story of how it is to work on the fishing boat. Coming back to contract, so 73% of the workers we interviewed overall had a contract that is, of course, heavily regulated in Vietnam because of, you know, everything is done through the government, so there has to be contracts. They're quite common in Myanmar, and also you see in Indonesia. In Cambodia, we see an anomaly there. We suspect that's related to fishers because of the Cambodian government's prohibition on formal recruitment for migrant fishers. So that's why it's so low. Now, it should also be pointed out that just because people have a contract, it doesn't guarantee that they have protection. Yeah. So a lot of times there are things like what's called contract substitution. So they may sign a contract, says, I'm going to earn this much. This is how many hours I work. But in the end, they work more days, they work more hours. And so in fact, their hourly salary, it's much less than what has been promised. Here you can see work hours for fishers in the red there and for seafood workers in the blue. These are very long hours. Just think about your own job. I mean, fisher works 14 hours a day. That amounts to 94 hours a week. And if that fisher was to go to Taiwan or China, it could be even higher at around 15 hours on average. Remember, this is the average. So some people work longer than that. And then you look at seafood workers, and that looks normal, right? This is 9 hours a day, 6 days a week. Well, you know, that's a 60-hour week, right? CEOs of companies, yeah, they typically put in 60 hours a week, but this is a factory worker. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Ben to continue to talk, and then, well, I think we'll have questions at the end. Thank you so much.
So Ben Atkins, just brief introduction, I think is the soul of the Ship and Shore program. So please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the kind introduction, and good to see so many friendly faces, familiar faces in the audience today. Great to be back at Sea Junction with our friends Rapid Asia and with Royce Thai here also. So moving on, wages are a key issue we wanted to look at in the survey. And so as many of you probably know, what's called wage theft, or not paying wages as they should be, it's one of the most common forms of abuse for migrant workers. And in fact, these can be considered an indicator of forced labor in some forms. We know particularly for migrant workers in informal sectors of work, and that includes fishing in many cases, migrants are particularly vulnerable to being subjected to wage-related abuses. So overall, what we found in the study is that the wages were about $660 US per month for fishers and seafood processors. But we also see a lot of variation in the wages that were paid depending on the sector and the country. So what we found is that the wages were highest, as you would expect, in the developed destinations of Korea and Japan, and much lower in Taiwan, China, and Thailand. And in fact, you know, what we looked at is whether those wages were actually in compliance with the legal minimum wage, which is a very common form of wage theft. What we found, based on a rough estimation, is that only about half of the surveyed migrant fishers were in fact receiving the minimum wage. And the wages in the seafood processing sector much more likely to be compliant. So the next thing we looked at for migrant workers was freedom of association and collective bargaining. And of course, what we know is that migrant workers all over the world face very substantial challenges in joining trade unions, signing collective agreements to improve their working conditions. That problem is particularly compounded in the fishing industry because there's a very small number of trade unions that are really operational in this sector of work. It's very informal, as I said. It's a hard to reach industry. So many unions are not actually active in organizing migrants in fishing. We did an estimate of kind of the current state of play for organizing of migrant fishers and seafood processing workers. What we found was that trade union density is about 4% in those two industries. So it's quite low. Fishers in Japan and seafood processors in Korea, they were the most likely to be organized. But in Thailand, in fact, what we found is that less than 1% of migrant fishers and seafood processors were organized into a trade union. As Roy Sai can speak to, that's probably actually a generous estimate. What we see is, of course, in Thailand, there's a major barrier to migrants organizing in that the Labor Relations Act prevents them from joining trade unions, becoming a member of a trade union committee. And that is often framed as a national security concern, but we know it also prevents worker power for migrants in these industries. The next issue we looked at is occupational injuries in these sectors. So as we know, in fact, work in fishing is one of the world's most hazardous sectors of work. The data on deaths in the industry is quite limited, but the estimates are that 100,000 fishing related deaths occur each year globally. So it is a very risky sector. And of course, we know safety and health is not as risky in seafood processing work, but there are still quite a significant hazards in the industry. It's cold temperatures that they're operating in. They're using heavy equipment. The floors are slippery. So there are, in fact, a lot of injuries in seafood processing work as well. What we found in the survey is that about a quarter of migrant fishing and seafood processing workers had experienced serious work-related injuries requiring medical attention. And in fact, because many of them were out at sea on fishing boats when these injuries occurred, many of them had significant delays in actually receiving treatment, which is a real problem. And in fact, some fishers, the captain is reluctant to bring the boat back to shore. They want to keep fishing, even though there's been a significant injury on board. The other thing we found in the survey is actually there's a very clear correlation between the hours being worked and injuries. So if they worked excessively long hours, 20 hours or more, sorry, I didn't go to the next, then they were 3 times more likely to have an injury. So in the fishing industry, where, as Daniel was talking about, it's very common to have very long hours, not set working hours for each day, migrants on those vessels are at much higher risk for severe occupational injuries. So we have another quote for you on the topic of forced labor. A Vietnamese fisher who worked in Taiwan told us, "I could not leave my job because they kept my salary. They only paid me $100 per month, and I was told the rest of my wages would not be provided until the contract was completed." Some of the other fishers asked to receive their salary so that they could change boats, but the vessel owner always refused to pay them. "I really wanted to leave because the working conditions were terrible, but I knew I would not receive my wages if I did." So that leads us into our estimate of the prevalence of forced labor. The ILO actually developed a methodology for use in empirical research studies in 2018, which we applied during this research study. It's based upon the definition of forced labor in the ILO's Forced Labor Convention, which is evaluates the two elements of involuntary work and threat or menace of penalty for each survey respondent. So then a case of forced labor is identified if both of those conditions are present within a single reference period of employment. However, of course, these two elements, they're quite complex. So we don't just go ask fishers directly, were you working involuntarily? Was there a menace of penalty for you leaving the job? We actually develop indicators of these two elements of forced labor, and that's what we ask to assess forced labor. So this is quite a detailed table, but just to summarize it for you, more than 1 out of 5 migrant workers in the fishing and seafood processing sectors showed indications of working involuntarily. The most common indicators found were having to be on call to work at any time and deception related to their conditions of work. Those two conditions, those two indicators of involuntariness, what you see from the data is actually they're prevalent across all of the destination countries in Asia. There's really a common pattern of vulnerability in these industries across the region. In particular, we know problems with being forced to work unpredictable and often excessive hours, really an endemic problem in the fishing sector within the region. And in addition, we know that migrant fishers are especially vulnerable to deception by unscrupulous recruiters. And what happens, of course, for fishers is that once they're on board a fishing vessel, particularly if it's a distant water fishing vessel and they're at sea for a long period of time, it's very hard for them to leave that employment situation. 1 out of 10 migrant fishing and seafood processing workers also showed indications of experiencing a threat or menace of penalty for leaving their work. And most frequently, this was related to retention of identity documents and phones, being kept under surveillance, and not being allowed to leave the workplace. So what we know, of course, is it is a very common practice for vessel owners and skippers to hold passports, to hold work permits, to hold seamen's books for migrant fishers. And ostensibly, this is often presented as, well, we're holding these for safekeeping so they don't get damaged. But we know, of course, in practice, that also prevents fishers from leaving their jobs. And similar to the indicators of involuntary work, the likelihood that migrants were unable to leave their job because of a threat or menace of penalty is much higher in the Taiwanese and Chinese fleets. And in fact, in China, what we see is that 22% of migrants reported experiencing physical violence. And physical violence has to be considered a very severe indicator of forced labor. So what we produced was an overall estimate that about 1 out of 8 migrant workers in the fishing and seafood processing sectors were employed in situations of forced labor. It was much more common in the fishing sector at 20% versus seafood processing at 1%. What we also see is that because of the highly gendered pattern of employment in those two sectors, of course, men work in fishing, seafood processing is dominated by women. There's a very closely correlated difference in forced labor between men and women. If we look at the countries of origin, Indonesian migrant workers were by far the most likely to be employed in conditions of forced labor at 30%, followed by Myanmar migrants at 10%, Cambodian migrants at 8%, and Vietnamese migrants at 1%. If we look at the destination countries where they were actually employed in conditions of forced labor, 25% of migrants in Taiwan, 9% in Thailand, 5% in Japan, 2% in the Republic of Korea showed indications of forced labor. In China, we had a relatively small sample, but the sample we did get showed very high rates of forced labor. So 28 out of the 51 migrants in the Chinese fleet that we interviewed showed indications of forced labor. So given that, of course, all of these cases were pretty much in the fishing industry, we decided to do a deep dive analysis to look at sort of different segments of the fishing sector where there were the most substantial problems with forced labor. What we found is that forced labor among migrant fishers in Taiwan was the highest at 28%, followed by Thailand at 18%, Republic of Korea at 2%. And again, because we had a relatively small sample in China, we didn't calculate a prevalence rate also for Japan. But the data that we had for China, again, shows an extremely high rate of forced labor is probably occurring in the Chinese fleet. We also looked at the types of fishing gear that was being used because there's often a correlation there with forced labor. And indeed, long line fishing on board distant water tuna fishing vessels was by far the highest rate of forced labor at 24%, followed by purse seine fishing and trawl net fishing. What we know, of course, from past studies is that indeed the long line tuna fishing industry in particular, because the work schedules are so arduous, because the fishers are at sea for months, even sometimes years at a time, the rates of forced labor are extremely high. And the other thing we found is that, of course, unsurprisingly, if you were at sea for a longer fishing voyage, there's a clear correlation with higher rates of forced labor. So about 1/3 of migrant fishers that were on a vessel at sea for 6 months or more experienced forced labor. So what we know, of course, is that part of the vulnerability to forced labor is about barriers to accessing redress when migrants experience abuses. There are obstacles for all migrant workers, but we know in fishing they are particularly severe. And that's because, of course, fishers spend long periods of time at sea, so they can't just go complain. They lack communications equipment often to reach shore and make a complaint. And in other cases, of course, there's unclear jurisdiction of authorities about who is actually responsible for that case of abuse if it is on the high seas, for example. So among the migrant workers who showed indications of forced labor, only about 1/3 said they sought assistance. And the most common reasons for not seeking help were things like not knowing who to go to, not feeling that the problem was serious enough because they had language barriers with the responsible authorities, but also especially because they feared retaliation if they did make a complaint. So they thought they would be fired if they did so. So for migrants who did seek assistance, most of them actually go to friends and family for informal support. And here, I think it's really notable that respondents, they didn't go to labor authorities, they didn't go to police, they didn't go to other government officials in destination countries. And what that really demonstrates, that's really who they should go to, right? They don't trust those authorities to handle the case fairly. And so they don't go to those sources of assistance. So while more than half of the migrants who sought assistance said that they were able to resolve their problems, what we see, of course, is yes, if they went through an informal channel for assistance, the resolutions that were provided to them were probably quite limited in scope. So one last quote here is from an Indonesian fisher who worked in China. And he said, overall, I think my migration experience was negative because I really did not have much choice. I had to work abroad because in Indonesia, it's very difficult to earn a good salary without more education. Had I known that I was never actually going to be paid what I was promised, I never would have left to Gaul. I spent 8 long years in the middle of the sea, and there was no one there to help me but God. So this is my fancy attempt at an AI conclusion. So bear with me. But in conclusion, Thailand's fishing and seafood processing sectors, of course, have been really a global focus of concerns about the exploitation of migrant workers during the last decade. What we see from the study is that although that attention to working conditions in the blue economy definitely not misplaced, the problems in Thailand are really part of a broader decent work deficit within the region. And the findings particularly highlight the higher prevalence of abuse on distant water tuna fishing vessels in China and Taiwan, where excessive work hours and long periods at sea really heighten the vulnerability of fishers to coercion. However, I do want to stress here, none of the flag states that we looked at were found to be entirely free from cases of forced labor. And that suggests that problems with coercive labor practices very widespread within the region. In addition, the heavy reliance on women to perform low-paid, precarious, and often informalized work in the seafood processing sector value chain, it's really been neglected because what they have focused on in the industry is the traceability of the seafood product, not the working conditions for women in the industry. And what the scale of exploitation revealed by the study clearly shows, these problems are not caused by a few bad apple employers and recruiters. It's not so much an issue of criminality. These are really systemic challenges within the industry that need to be addressed. So how can we go about addressing some of those problems? The key recommendations of the report are to develop worker-centered approaches to private sector due diligence. And this is really an important step to move away from kind of these corporate-led initiatives that rely on audits, that rely on third-party certifications that we know don't actually protect fishers. Ratify and fully implement the conventions of the ILO related to recruitment, work in fishing, forced labor, freedom of association, and collective bargaining to ensure legally binding minimum standards for decent work in these industries. Improve enforcement by applying a multidisciplinary approach to inspection of fishing vessels, as well as increasing the effectiveness of inspections in identifying labor rights violations and promoting occupational safety and health. Remove the legal restrictions to organizing and support workers' organizations to really take root and flourish, to start rebalancing the scales towards greater social justice for migrant workers. Enhance wage protection to protect migrant workers from what we know are some of the most common forms of abuse, and that includes underpayment of wages, withholding of wages, and illegal wage deductions. And finally, transform discriminatory gender norms in the fishing and seafood processing sectors, including the major concerns we see with gender wage gaps, lack of maternity protection, and violence and harassment. Thank you very much, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive overview. So in spite of the cute AI design, I think the situation is quite depressing. But we are going to listen now to Rosai. She is a well-known activist, particularly for migrants in the fishery. So she has been asked to give a review of the report.
Sawadee everyone. My name is Roy Sai. I'm here actually representing the organization called Freedom Fund. We actually work in the Asia Pacific on the fishery, and we've been working in Thailand for 10 years. And we also have program in Taiwan, Indonesia, a little bit in Vietnam and India. And first, I would like to thank ILO and Rapid Asia to conduct very comprehensive survey, especially voice of the worker themselves, and that what have been lacked for any dialogue that we're talking about human rights and supply chain and corporate accountability. The unique of this report is actually interview the worker who return to their origin country. And I think workers felt comfortable to share what their concern and voice. Unlike most research, when we did interview somewhere near the pier and the port, we can sense the pressure that worker withhold a lot of answer. And I would like to echo the recommendation made by the report itself about the issue of seafood. It beyond the ocean is actually involving consumer, buyers, retailers who actually part of need to share both profit and responsibility to ensure transparency and fair in the supply chain. For Freedom Fund and Humanity United, we also did the research that we call 10-year retrospective, which is actually looking back 10 years, how Thailand has made progress in terms of fishery reform and governance. And what we have learned, which similar to the report is say, we try to fix the problem of the producers, vessel owner, seafood processor here, but actually the change was completely driven by the external pressure from supermarket, from retailer, from the buyers. In 2016, when Thai government was under the pump, hot seat, that they need to reform the industry. That because the Guardian picked up the story and make a report. And through the years of the military junta and even other government who actually work with the Thai stakeholder to ratify international convention, amend the law, or improve the labor inspection capacity at the port, at the pre-processing site, or at the seafood factory. It is driven by the commercial purpose, the trade purpose. Unfortunately, Thailand is not rewarded for the good commitment. Thailand itself actually lose the market share in the seafood. When you invest to pay worker properly, to subsidize the recruitment fee and cost, there is no mechanism of sharing responsibility from the corporate. And I think this is very important to talk about the ocean by involve going beyond the ocean. As you can see from the research, people can still go from sourcing their seafood plate from Thailand, ship to Indonesia, to China, to Taiwan, to Korea. And currently the decision is made based on the price, not the cost. The more, the cheaper the price you are, you will get reward. But once you try to be responsible producer, you get punished. And I think it's very important to highlight the role of the market itself. How could you support any reformation to continue and sustain? Currently, Thai government is considering to amend the fishery law again, and it becomes struggle on the ground between vessel owner, fishery workers, labor inspector, and whoever involved, because the vessel owner, they don't see any reward for make a good change. While the Thai authority, they felt like they need to do the favor, the trade, the commercial partners, you know, to confidence in the seafood. And I think I would like to highlight another things that I learned in the seafood industry, that even though we make a lot of legal reform, but we never transfer power back to the worker. That's why we have very low number of the unionization. Even Thailand itself, that we invest, you know, to introduce a lot of new law, but we never consider allow migrant workers who are the majority seafood worker to form the union. And I hope we're going to have the new government, right? So I hope. Therefore, we will resume conversation with the EU about the FTA, and I hope that during this conversation, the dialogue on Thailand EU FTA or any other trade, any trade agreement and countries, we will be able to consider the component of sustainability and worker power. To myself, I think it's very hard to drive Thai stakeholders to recognize the role of trade union because, as I say, the Thai stakeholder do not see reward at all, or they don't have any commercial encouragement to change their behavior. So I hope that the market itself will help, or the external pressure will continue and maintain and ask for Thailand to commit on the trade union. However, they need to reinforce the similar dialogue and conversation on fishery governance, not in the country that mentioned in the report, in Korea, in China, or even the ASEAN country members, because it cannot be single country approach to make reform. And I think the report has been highlighted about the gap of international law and I would say the compliance checklist rather than the transformation of the supply chain. And I think the last comment that I would like to make about this report, I think we are at the stage of confusion about trade, global trade. Everyone always talk about like, oh, we are in the new trade war. I don't know. It's hard to understand international politics nowadays, but we know that trade has been used as a new weapon of forming the strategic partnership and relationship, right? And there is also pressure from the consumer that they expect that retailers or producer will carefully produce seafood, that they don't feel guilty to consume it. We are going to have a lot of new legislation related to human rights due diligence, fair trade, and certification to make assurance or confidence to the consumer that they will have a good quality seafood with responsible conduct. But again, without engagement of the worker, those due diligence process will be just top-down box ticking. But I don't know, this is like in Thai we say egg and hen chick problem. If we transfer power to the worker, encourage unionization, it means there will be higher cost of seafood production. But if market expect for the responsible production without paying any cost, it wouldn't last that long. So, so thank you again for the report and help, I think, the audience to understand the linkage of the seafood in our plate. Because for example, if you consume shrimp, it's actually involved trawler for feed meals, aquaculture industry, seafood processing site to peeling and make your shrimp available in your dining table. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I am going to open the floor for the first 3 questions. Who wants to volunteer to go first? Question or comments, welcome. David is always first, okay. Other? Okay, 2, 1 third one, anyone? No, we start then with David first.
Thank you. I'm David Feingold. I think some of you know me. First of all, I want to really congratulate everyone on an excellent, very, very clear presentation. I think people who know me know that I'm hell on wheels on slick methodologies that don't work. So I have, one is a very technical question, might be my eyesight. It looked like the scoop net ships were the highest. But more generally, and perhaps more important, is if you go back 40, 50 years ago, there was no trafficking in the Thai fishing industry because you had basically small boats going out, most of it crewed with exchange labor, and it was coastal fishing. So a lot of this goes directly back to the complete destruction of coastal fishing happening all over the world. But I did quite a bit of work on this 10, 15 years ago. And with the exception of, some nice regulations, this presentation, excellent as it was, could have been presented 10 or 15 years ago. It doesn't look like, for particularly the people on the boats, I think the processing has improved somewhat, that things have changed. And here we go back to what I think is really, really important, is if you don't let people organize, we're going to be here 10 years from now having another, perhaps even better AI presentation dealing with the same thing.
Hi, thank you. My name is Aryo. I'm from Indonesia. First of all, congratulations for the launchings. It's give me a very massive update on the situations. But I'm particularly interested on the freedom of associations. I think for the migrant fishing industry, this is one of the a very major issues. During 2008 to 2009, I spent more than a month in Taiwan. I crossed from Kaohsiung, Hsinchu, Taipei until the one that used Yilan. It's supposed to be in Kaohsiung, right? South Taiwan. During that time, and the Taiwan government do not recognize migrants to form a union. They can be a member, but they are not allowed. So during that time, in my investigation, there is a two major problem. They are being recognized as migrant, but they are not being recognized as a worker. So they are not allowed to form a union. The same things also happen in Korea. In Korea, you are never being allowed. There, I have a strong network for them. There is a call migrant trades unions. It's an independent unit who are affiliate to KCTU, Korean Confederations. But they, as far as I know, they do not have a sector on the fishing. So this is actually quite good. Since last time I'm in Taiwan, it took 1 decade. They are recognizing. The one that I would like to clarify, maybe further explanation for the presentator is, do they recognize this union under their labor law? I can give you example. In Hong Kong, the labor law is recognizing migrants. Migrants are allowed to form a trade unions. In the same times, migrants also being allowed to form an associations. These two entities have a different approach when they are showing or asserting their collective bargaining power. The union could go pass through the labor tribunal and everything. The association cannot. So this is also become one of the major challenge, how the migrant workers in general pursuing access to justice, but also in particular, which is very happen now in the fishing industry. Thank you.
Okay, we will start maybe Rosai first and then.
Okay, I will focus on making comment about the union and Thailand. If you look at this fact sheet on the condition for change, key historical, unfortunately, the reformation of seafood industry in Thailand was occur under the military government. And the growth of the unionization is linked with the democratization process. And I believe, but this is sad, we are at the junction on the democratization movement in Thailand. The current in the recent election, it showed that people vote for the ideal of nationalism and patriot. And there is an increasing xenophobia comment against migrant worker, or there is a cause of the Cambodian worker decide to flee to Thailand. Even though Thailand currently are under dialogue with the EU on the FTA, and one of the, I would say, the sustainability chapter of the EU itself actually asking for the any trade partnering country to ratify ILO convention, including 87 and 98, which is discussed about the collective bargaining and trade union. I think and government actually formed the task force to review the amendment of Thai law in order to ratify convention. But the sense of nationalism, hatred against migrant worker, and zero ability to deal with the mislead information online, it will be the big obstruction against the progress of freedom of association for migrant workers in Thailand. And this is a thing that we need to bring on the table, that it will get harder with the new government to on the recognition on the basic rights of the worker, especially migrant worker.
Thanks, Royce. I'll come in quick on David's question and the FOA question. Yeah, sorry, just to clarify, the scoop net fishing sample was pretty small, and that's why we didn't include it as sort of the highest prevalence of forced labor. It's just too small to really conclusively determine. So that's the explanation there. The bigger question, has it changed, right? In Thailand, has it gotten better? Is it the same as it was before all the reforms happened? This is quite a challenging question. And of course, you know, Roy Tsai's organization just did a big evaluation of this, trying to figure out, you know, what has and hasn't changed. I think what we see is in Thailand, there are the structures in place for regulation, improved regulation of the fishing industry. A lot of the enforcement is still very problematic. We have these port in, port out centers across in 30 coastal provinces. They're inspecting around a quarter of the vessels coming in and out. There's a mechanism that could enforce labor laws in the industry. What we know, in fact, is that the violations being identified are extremely limited. And there are still very significant problems with particularly issues around wage theft, but also more severe abuses like forced labor still happening. I don't think there's any question about that. And I think what Roy Tsai mentioned is really what we tried to get across in the report, is that you had a lot of sort of externally driven reforms of the industry. There was a lot of pressure from the EU yellow card. The US TIP report had put a lot of pressure on Thailand. There were a lot of media articles condemning the fishing industry in Thailand. And so a lot At the time, there was a military government in place. A lot of top-down reforms happened, and they weren't entirely embraced, as we know, by all the stakeholders in the industry. And particularly, we know there have been challenges with vessel owners not necessarily complying with all the new regulations that have been put in place. So I think it is a difficult question to answer conclusively. I think there has been progress, but in terms of the actual sort of on the ground working conditions for migrant workers in the fishing and seafood processing sectors, there still are a lot of challenges. And I think that comes across in the report. The question on freedom of association, yeah, thanks for raising this. I mean, in fact, Taiwan, it's a little challenging for us. We cannot, as the ILO, work in Taiwan because it is, of course, a province of China officially for the UN, territory of China. So we can't have on the ground activities in Taiwan. And we know that the fishing industry there, particularly the distant water fishing industry, is quite problematic. There have been a lot of steps taken by the government in Taiwan to improve conditions. And in fact, one thing that they have done is recognize 2 formal migrant fisher unions. And this is detailed in the report, so I hope you will have a read. But there is one in Keelung, the Keelung Migrant Fishers Union, as well as a more recent one that was established, which are formally recognized as trade unions in the country. So they do have the legal right to bargain collectively for better conditions. So that's a step in the right direction. We, of course, would like to see Thailand take similar steps to formally recognize migrant trade unions in Thailand. But at least it is sort of a small positive step in the right direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, maybe I can add a few cents. I don't think I can talk too much about the trade unions, but thank you for recognizing the charts. We do put a lot of work into making, presentable charts at Rapid Asia. I mean, it's interesting. I think the forced labor framework generally is it's a very robust and very good indicator that ILO has developed. That has also evolved, so it keeps getting improved. So it was interesting when we actually did our first study in Thailand. The forced labor, don't quote me, I think it was around 28% of fishers that we surveyed were in a situation of forced labor. And then after, I think there were a number of legislation had been introduced, we measured again, and that number was reduced to 14%. And then coming back from this study, this was after COVID, we saw it went up, but it didn't go back to what it was in the first study, but it did go up. So I mean, this is something that you can measure and you can see how it changes over time, but obviously you also need to look at other factors. Forced labor is one thing, but we also want decent work conditions. So you have to look at minimum wage conditions and other things. In terms of the freedom association, we recently did a study in Cambodia with platform workers. And a similar situation there, we had some questions about, people joining unions, and of course, that's basically non-existent. But what was interesting was that these workers, and many of them are very young, especially the delivery drivers, so they are between 18 to 25 years old. They formed informal networks, sort of support networks. And it was interesting when we looked at that versus, for example, experiencing discrimination, we could see clearly that workers that were part of these informal networks were better off. Unfortunately, this was not something we expected, so we didn't have a lot of questions on it. So it's probably something that has to be looked at again. But it was interesting to see that even informal networks sometimes also can be helpful in situations where you can't set up sort of these formal institutions.
Thank you. I am going to open for a last round. Okay, first Sarah, yes, and then Kunpravit, and then, okay, I don't want to only decide 3 and 4. Okay, so let's start with Sarah.
Hello, Sarah from RSO Bali Process. I wanted to go back to that comment on the role of the market. So if in the end, increased regulations, monitorings can result in higher cost and losing business for the industry. So what could be the solution? Is it more to increase consumers' pressure? Is it looking at due diligence from the buyer's country or subsidize from the governments here? So what could be a way to counteract that?
Okay, thank you. Kunpravit.
This by Pravit Rojanapur from Council on English. Just two, I think 2 questions. First of all, thank you very much for the very comprehensive report. I think it's really useful. Now, could you did mention Benjamin, you did mention Taiwan and how they have recognized 2 trade unions. So could you give us an idea of other countries that being listed there, referring to South Korea, China, and Japan vis-a-vis, you know, the situation here in Thailand and Taiwan that you have just mentioned. And secondly, on the consumer side, particularly in Europe, since the EU is involved in this symposium or table, is there any move towards something that we might call a fair trade seafood products in the member states of the EU, or if not, you know, we talk about Royce, I talk about the fact that the cost of the seafood cannot be, you know, made competitive if certain criteria or levels of labor rights are being protected or recognized here in Thailand. Thank you.
Okay, 3. Yes.
I will translate for him.
Oh, okay. I
Okay.
can translate also. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. Perkenalkan, nama saya Juari. Maaf, saya tidak bisa berbahasa Inggris. Saya Juari dari SBMI, Serikat Buruh Migran Indonesia.
Is Juari is sorry cannot speak in English, but is from SBI, which is one of the Serikat Union of workers in Indonesia. Yeah.
Ya, pertama saya mau menanyakan hasil laporan untuk Indonesia tidak ditampilkan data seafood processing.
You want to ask first about the report, why you are not showing data for the seafood processing in Indonesia.
Padahal di Indonesia banyak perusahaan-perusahaan pengolah hasil ikan gitu.
While in Indonesia there are a lot of companies that process fish.
Oke, terus saya juga mau mengvalidkan berdasarkan data yang ada di SBMI, memang 2 negara, Cina dan Taiwan, ini berdasarkan data kasus yang ada di SBMI ini paling tinggi.
So according to him, according to the data that they have with SPI, the highest cases are with China and Taiwan.
Ya, SBMI pun setiap tahun mengeluarkan laporan, ada Shibon. Jadi SBMI bersama Greenpeace setiap tahun membuat laporan, terutama di sektor perikanan negara Taiwan.
So every year they make a score or ranking and an examination of the situation with Greenpeace together. Yeah.
Ya,
About Taiwan.
ya, SBMI punya film dokumenter juga terkait tentang perikanan itu Before You Eat.
They also have a movie documentary about the problem in the fishing related industry
Ya,
in Taiwan.
SBMI bersama ILO ada punya MRC Migrant Resuscitator terkait tentang isu awak kapal perikanan.
Also, they have, in cooperation with ILO, they have a center which also serve about problem related to fisheries
Di dua
in Indonesia.
Di dua kabupaten di Tegal sama Pemalang.
In two district, Tegal and
Pemalang.
Pemalang, in Central Java.
Ya,
I think it's part of the ship to shore initiative. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
SBMI juga bersama Greenpeace sekarang sedang menggugat, mendampingi 5 ABK awak kapal perikanan menggugat Bumblebee di Amerika, perusahaan kalengan itu nanti sidangnya di bulan Mei.
So they are doing a court case against an American company. What is the name?
Bumblebee.
Bumblebee, yeah. They're making exactly for problem with the fishermen experienced.
Ya, mungkin.
Okay, mungkin ini atau ada pertanyaan?
Tadi pertanyaannya terkait tentang seafood processing.
So the only question is about the seafood
Kenapa
processing.
tidak ada datanya di laporan itu? Padahal Indonesia sebagai negara maritim.
Yeah. Okay. Now last.
Hello, yeah. I'm Varuni from Save the Children Thailand. Thank you so much for this interesting study. I'm sorry I missed the first bit of the presentation, but I quickly glanced through the tables and just came across the profiles of the migrant workers, and then realized that those who are below 19 years of age is like 1 or less than 1% in most cases. So I'm just interested in knowing, is it like, from your perspective, could there be incidents of like, fraudulent documentation, or there could be, is it because the regulations have improved and whether as a sector, we are taking more stricter regulations on that matter and force, because in the past, as far as I know, forced child labor and child exploitation in the sector was significant, and just wanted to interested to know as to about the figures. Thank you.
Okay, Danielle, we start with. Okay, you can the other questions. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think, Sarah, the first question you're asking about if the cost for the industry, if that can be passed on to consumers in some way. Okay. I mean, I in my previous life, so sort of working in the private sector, I think it can be done. I think there are 2 dimensions to that. One, it depends a little bit on the country and the culture of the country, and is it an egalitarian culture, like say in Australia, for example? Then I think it's relatively easy to do. In other countries, it could be more difficult. But I think we are already seeing examples of this, responsible supply chains and people producing, whether it's coffee or other products, and they're being labeled in a certain way and promoted to consumers as, responsible products. So when you talk about the concept of responsible consumerism and tourism, and I mean, these are concepts that are alive and they have been successful. But it has to be marketed properly. It doesn't happen by itself. You need to have clever marketing behind it. Okay. Why we didn't interview people in the seafood sector? Because we didn't find any women in Indonesia that had worked in seafood. It's actually mentioned as one of the limitations in the report. I think a lot of women in Indonesia, they migrate for other types of work. It's not that they don't migrate; they go work as maids in Malaysia and in other places. So it's just not something that is common in Indonesia, at least not in the places that we went. So we found predominantly men that had migrated for fishing.
Yeah, thanks for all the questions. A lot of good ones. Start with Kun Pravid. Yeah, I mean, I think if we look to models of labor migration governance within Asia, the ILO often points to Korea as sort of probably the best practice in terms of how you can manage temporary labor migration in a way that is most protective of migrant workers' rights. So in particular, of course, we do see higher rates of unionization of migrants in Korea, partly because, they've been very explicit within their labor law framework that migrants have exactly the same rights as national workers. And that's really critical, because if you don't give migrants the same rights as national workers, you create a race to the bottom on their wages and working conditions. You have to protect all workers in the labor market the same, or else you're going to, in fact, undercut the national workers in the labor market as well. And you don't want to see wages, working conditions depressed because you're admitting migrant workers. No country wants to see that. So Korea is probably our key example there. Yes, I mean, of course, we have our donor, the EU, in the room with us today, but they have done a lot of excellent work in terms of improving trade practices. Particularly, of course, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which will be implemented in the future, is probably going to be quite a game changer within the region. It will be much higher standards for the sourcing practices of companies from the EU when they're buying here. And as a project, we will be a part of helping to make sure that the private sector within the region can comply with those standards. So we will be directly involved in that process. I do just want to also mention the forced labor directive that the EU has also recently enacted, which is quite a strict ban on importation of products made with forced labor into the EU. And a lot of work, of course, will have to be put into implementing that comprehensively. But what we've seen from other countries like the US who have implemented these forced labor bans is that they're not a magic bullet, but they can be an important step towards preventing importation of products made with forced labor. As Daniel said, in fact, a lot of Indonesians do work in seafood processing nationally within the labor market, but they don't tend to migrate for that type of work. So we did, in fact, hope to interview Indonesian migrants in seafood processing. It wasn't possible based upon the data collection that we did. We didn't identify respondents, and I think that does represent the fact that most of the women in that industry are working domestically as opposed to internationally. But thank you to our partner SBMI, who's done some excellent work in protecting migrant workers in the fishing industry, in particular in Indonesia. Finally, the question on child labor, I think it was, and has child labor been reduced as a result of the reforms? I mean, I think we can fairly say in some respects it has gotten better. Particularly because one thing the port in, port out centers do quite well is they do check documents. So in terms of the age of the people working on the fishing vessels, it's much more difficult to get away with having children on board your vessel without being caught. There are limitations there. Of course, smaller fishing vessels not necessarily required to go through the port in, port out inspections. But I think what we've seen is indeed there is a decline in child labor within the industry. The other piece of it on the seafood processing side is that children often work, they used to work quite a bit in what were called peeling sheds. And this was sort of how big seafood processing companies would outsource their labor and not be responsible for the conditions in those peeling sheds. Most of the big companies, particularly if they are linked to international buyers, no longer outsource to peeling sheds. But we know that there are still women, children employed at home doing this kind of informal seafood processing work in Thailand. It's very difficult to regulate because partly because it's a matter of poverty, and until you eliminate kind of the root causes of it, as well as access to education, of course, it's difficult to completely eliminate child labor. I mean, in some cases, the children are doing it to help their families. It's not necessarily that they're being forced to do it, for example. So I think I will stop there and hand over to Royce.
Okay.
Would make comment
Yes,
about
please.
the purchasing practices, what the retailers could do better. Actually, 2 months ago, I interviewed shrimp farmers who are in the global supply chain of the big supermarket. I will echo what is the recommendation from their end. First, they would like to develop the stable and long-term relationship with the supermarket, because and this is linked with the transparency of the supply chain. If the supermarket is able to trace back where the products are made, involved, and from, as well as they know that they're not yet doing the best practice in terms of employment or any extra welfare and benefit for the worker. But if there is a cost, are there any possible of responsibility sharing from the brand? For example, most of the retailers and big companies are promoting the zero recruitment scheme, where workers should not pay any single dollar in order to come to work. And when I talk to the shrimp farmer and processor, they said that they're happy to pay for the worker if the retailer could at least guarantee maybe like quota of sourcing the product from them, or help their business be able to operate with the stability. And if they found a mistake in the supply chain, what is the investment from the retailer side to help the suppliers to improve? Not, okay, the news talking about certain factory issue, and they just cut the tie with the supply chain, go to the new place. So we have to break the cycle of, I usually call hit and run. We're going to hear more the Lego battle. For example, the case of Bumblebee, when they promote that they implement the fair labor practice in the business, but in the reality it's not. But I don't think that we can use the Lego warfare as a solution, but it's more about the transparency of supply chain and make the supply chain stable enough for people to commit, invest, make change. And I would like to add a little bit comment about the issue of child labor. As you can see, majority of migrant workers in Thailand are from Myanmar, which happen to experience the economic hardship and civil war. We have seen the number of younger people come to Thailand, maybe the adolescent one, age between 15 to 18, who actually use the document that show that they are over 18, and they actually work in the seafood global supply chain. And Thai processor or the supplier here unable to verify the age of the worker. Nobody will, take the worker for DNA test to verify the age. They will look at the document. And I can say that there will be increasing number of young people from Myanmar attempt to come to Thailand. And another thing that if we want to fix the issue of child labor, I think we need to act more on the shared responsibility of the factories, employer or processor, you know, to run childcare, to support the local school to accommodate migrant children. If you open the news, social media in Thailand now, there are the what should I call them? Like Te Ashiwa. What do you call them in English? Social media influencer who actually campaign to stop free education program for migrant children. They actually submit the open letter to the Ministry of Education, which means that many Thai people still think that to support migrant education is about the Thai tax money. But in reality, we need to work together to make our supply chain seems to be like, you know, reliable. They don't understand the whole ESG fancy terminology nowadays. And this is the part that I will sort of condemn the Thai employer who keep silence and get away from the economic benefit from migrant worker employment. And they just like, okay, I don't care. Whatever outside factory is not my responsibility. Thank you.
Applause, yes, applause for the speaker. There is much more to say on social protection, the fact that many migrants actually should get social protection and don't get, and this is money that goes that is in the report, yes, but today we didn't talk about, but this is all money that goes to the government actually of the country. But okay, we don't have time to talk about this. We expect people to be responsible, although these days our leaders are not so responsible, but hopefully hopefully they will follow our advice to be more responsible in what we do, what we say, and of course, like was said before, the importance of democratization for unionizing workers, not only migrants. I think this is very important points, and there are many other important points in the report. You can continue the conversation outside with coffee and tea. Yes, a report I think we have distributed already, but there are more copy. I also want to invite you to take some of the stickers which were done by the Solidarity Collective, which is a group of young artists from Cambodia, Myanmar, and Thailand. And they are our partner in this project with ILO also. So to, again, try to use art to address some of the xenophobic feelings that are not only in Thailand, but I think all over the world these days. Please give a donation as usual. This help, even if this event is supported by LO, it cross-subsidize other activity. So be generous on your way out. And again, enjoy coffee and tea. A last applause to the, and on 3 March, we are going to have the opening of an exhibition on Klon Toi, which is an urban poor area, but it shows the life of people. And he's a Korean photographer who for 20 years gone back to take picture of these people. So it shows the life of the people of Klon Toi with a lot of respect and empathy. So come again on the 3rd of March. Thank you very much.